All right, 1 Samuel chapter 17. First Samuel chapter 17, a very well-known passage. I think everyone knows this story. We've heard this story from the time that we were little. Anybody that's been to Sunday school, anybody that's been around church folks any length of time, which I know you all have, so everybody's familiar with this story. We're going to try to cover the first half of it tonight. The whole chapter, 58 verses, is a little much to try to cover in one night, so we'll try to cover the first half of it, and we'll talk tonight about the defiance of Goliath. Okay, the defiance of Goliath. And continuing with our story, 1 Samuel chapter 16 was really important for us. Laid a lot of foundational work. Chapter 16 introduced David to us. We were able to see him anointed. We were able to see him selected as the next king. By definition, God is going to choose, or was going to choose, the next king as someone that he called after his own heart. Little by little, you start to see what that means. We'll see a little bit more of it even tonight. In chapter 16, we were able to see the Spirit of the Lord departing from Saul. Saul losing his ability. Saul losing the strength to lead the children of Israel the way that he needed to. And then we saw David introduced to Saul. A lot happens in that chapter. David now is introduced to the court of Israel. There's not really a capital, but you have the king and his surroundings there that would be more of a royal court as opposed to a palace or a particular capital. But David becomes the main focal point of the story, and it's chapter 17 that introduces David full scale to a wider range of folks, really the entire nation. He's been introduced to us because Samuel has selected him, or Samuel's anointed him after God's selection. And then he was introduced to the court of Israel, introduced to King Saul, and in chapter 17, he is introduced to the nation. Number one, let's talk about the defiance. Okay, the defiance of Israel. Chapter 17 is where we pick up in verse number 1. It says, "Now the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle, and were gathered together at Shokah, which belongeth to Judah, and pitched between Shokah and Azekah in Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and pitched by the valley of Elah, and set the battle in array against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on a mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, and there was a valley between them." Josephus notes that these events happened shortly after the events from chapter number 16. Now, what was important last week that we learned? We learned that the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul. Saul has become engulfed in anxiety, in depression. This evil spirit that comes from the Lord has rendered Saul kind of ineffective at times. So ineffective that it's advised him by his counselors that someone who is skillful come in and kind of help treat this. Play some music, soothe his mind, calm him down. And there's some that have speculated, and that's all the way from people like Josephus all the way down to modern times, the people like A.W. Pink, that have speculated whether Saul's discouragement and distraction made this a suitable time for the Philistines to kind of attack and avenge themselves. When we last saw the Philistines back in chapter 14, that was the story where Jonathan and his armor bearer were successful in their attack against the garrison of the Philistines. And then in the confusion, Saul took advantage of that and led his army to attack. And Saul was winning a great victory. Now, we learned from that chapter the victory could have been even greater. but Saul was able to lead a battle, lead a victory. We remember that part where Saul made that really silly, he gave that really silly order about, nobody eating anything until he said so, or until the battle was finished. And Jonathan hadn't heard about that. And just the controversy there that kind of embroiled. And they really lost focus on the battle. And a lot of the Philistines were able to escape. And historically, it appears from what a lot of writers write, this is the opportunity that the Philistines were going to take to avenge themselves of that and continue this war and continue this battle. And this place here, called the Valley of Elah, would become a site that people still talk about today. Now, if you have a map in the back of your Bible, if you find Bethlehem, you head west from there, and you'll see the place that's called the Valley of Elah. Verse number 4 says that there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. This giant, this champion. Now, we call him a giant. We say that Goliath was a giant for 2 reasons. The first one, we'll talk about his height, and we'll talk about that here. It says that he was 6 cubits and a span. Now, what is a cubit? The answer is that it depends on who you ask. It ranges everywhere from 15 to 18 to 21, 22 inches. Traditionally, though, for people that didn't have a measuring stick to measure out what 18 or 21 inches was, a cubit was kind of like from the tip of your elbow to the tip of your middle finger. Okay, so that would that's a rough definition of what a cubit would be. By the way, that's on a grown man, right? Not on a kid, because my cubit would be different than Elliot's cubit, right? But this would kind of be the estimated distance of a cubit. Maybe let's call it somewhere around 18 inches or so. We'll just kind of ballpark it as that. Now, he was 6 cubits and a span. What is a span? A span is, if you were to take your hand and you were to stretch out your fingers, it's kind of assumed that a span was the distance between your thumb and your pinky finger. Okay, that would be the span of a man's hand, right? The width of a man's hand. It's right at about half a cubit, right? So, like we would say, like 6.5 cubits. 6 cubits in a span. Goliath was very, very tall. He was estimated, 9 foot plus. That really wouldn't matter whose cubit that you used. To say that he was 6 cubits in a span means that he was very, very tall. 9+ feet tall. And you say, is that possible? Well, that would bring you to the second thing that I wanted you to talk about. Let's just use a couple of scriptures to define this one. Turn to the book of Numbers, chapter 13. Here's the other reason that people call Goliath a giant. It's not just by defining what 6 cubits in a span were. That just using those numbers tell us, yes, he was very tall. But another reason, let's look here what the scriptures say. Numbers 13, verse 32. It says here that they brought up an evil report of the land which they had searched unto the children of Israel, saying, the land through which we have gone to search it is a land that eateth up the inhabitants thereof. And all the people that we saw in it are men of a great stature. And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. The report that the spies, or at least 10 out of the 12 spies bring back, refer to, well, I guess the report of all 12 would have been, yeah, there's giants in the land. Now, 2 of the guys, Caleb and Joshua, they that wasn't anything to them, right? If the Lord's delivered this land into our hand, we can take care of this. But 10 of the spies looked at the giants, or looked at what they called the sons of Anak, these giants of the land, and we were grasshoppers before them. They're huge. They're mightier than we. They're stronger than we are. Notice what they're called there in verse 33, the giants, the sons of Anak. Now, keep that in mind, and let's turn to Joshua chapter 11. Joshua chapter 11. Now, when they went to occupy the land of promise, what was Israel commanded to do? Drive these inhabitants out, weren't they? Well, they did a very good job of that. In Joshua 11, at least Joshua was good at that. It says here, Joshua chapter 11, verse 21. It says, and at that time came Joshua and cut off who? The Anakims. Now, isn't that who we just talked about? The giants, the sons of Anak? Well, the Anakims, from the mountains, from Hebron, from Deber, from Anab, and from all the mountains of Judah, and from all the mountains of Israel, Joshua destroyed them utterly with their cities. There was none of the Anakims left in the land of the children of Israel, only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod there remained. Basically, if you don't know what that's talking about, Gaza is similar to the region that we call Gaza today. But Gaza and Ashdod and Gath and those places, those were far offset in the southwestern portion of the land of Israel. Kind of look at the maps in the back of your Bible sometime and you'll see Ashdod and Gaza and Gath and those places that are there. But notice, just kind of step the Bible from place to place. There were giants in the land, the sons of Anak. Joshua, when he comes into the land, he drives out those Anakims into places called what? Gath, Gaza, and Ashdod. Well, what did our Bible tell us? Who was Goliath? Goliath of Gath. One of these remnants, right? The remnants of these families that were known for being huge people. So to say that Goliath was a giant, to say that he was very tall, 6 cubits in a span, that's not a stretch. That's something that we've known about these people from that region for a long time. So on comes the scene, this one named Goliath, who was from Gath, the last remaining residue of these giants, these Anakim. And he's one of what they call the Philistines, the group of people that were driven into that area and inhabited that area. That is not to imply that all of the Philistines, historically or traditionally, were considered giants. But Goliath of Gath were, and his lineage is kind of traced through those scriptures that we had read there. But notice also this, our text, 1 Samuel 17, and let's pick up with verse 5. It says that he had a helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. The coat would refer that which would cover down from the shoulders down to the midsection there, a coat. But that coat of mail, the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. That's heavier than what our soldiers wear when they go into battle. We don't have our soldiers carrying 100-pound packs and 100-pound backpacks and those kind of things. Of course, our army doesn't have very many 9-foot soldiers either. We don't generally have people that are that size. But he was a huge man. He had a huge coat of mail. It says there in verse 6 that he had a greaves of brass upon his legs. Greaves are those things, the shin bones can be kind of weak. Probably not as weak on somebody who's 9 foot tall, but it's still the shin bones, if you reach down there, you can feel those. The shin bones aren't really protected by a ton of muscle. They're very vulnerable. It's really common for soldiers, especially in that time, to wear what they would call greaves, or things that would protect the front part of the legs. It says that there was a target of brass between his shoulders. That would refer to something that was really really to kind of to guard the neck area, something between the shoulders. He's got the coat of mail, but then he's also got something that would protect the neck area. So as it's outlining his armor, he's got the helmet, he's got the coat of mail, he's got the leg coverings, he's got something to protect the neck or throat area there between his shoulders. It says the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam. It says that his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and one bearing a shield went before him. So long, heavy spear. When your spear's head weighs 15 pounds or so, and the way that the mount is described there in verse number 7 as being like a weaver's beam, he's huge. He's heavily armored, you would say, and that carries a double meaning. He's got a lot of armor, and it's heavy armor, and he's well prepared for battle. One bearing a shield went before him. There was someone that went before him, like an armor bearer, to carry his shield. Now, I don't think that you would, and most people agree with that, you wouldn't interpret that as to say that when he was in the heat of battle, he stood behind someone else. In battle with a sword and a shield, he would carry those things. But as he went armed with his spear into battle, there would be someone designated to carry his shield until it got down to close quarters fighting or something like that. He was a huge man. This would have been very, very intimidating. Historically, you don't see any Israelites that could be described as 9 feet tall. This is not the armor that they wore. This was not something that they were used to seeing in previous battles with the Philistines, in previous battles with any of the other surrounding nations. This was not something that they had come accustomed to since the days that Joshua was driving these people out of the land of Israel. Verse number 8. And he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel and said unto them, Why are ye come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine, and ye servants to Saul? Choose you a man, and let him come down to me. As Goliath begins, and there's going to be a number of insults that are in here, and there's going to be a number of things that he says that are intended to intimidate. One of the first things that he announces is basically, hey, why all the fuss? Why the army? None of this is necessary, right? We don't need armies to settle this. And the language that he's using, basically, it kind of implies that he's baiting them. When he says in verse number 8, am I not a Philistine? It's just me. Just one Philistine. All these armies aren't necessary. No big, huge battle is necessary. Just one. I'm just a Philistine. And at your disposal, who do you have? You have all the servants of this grand and majestic king of Israel, right? You all are the servants of Saul. In verse number 9, we see his great contest. It says, if he be able to fight with me and to kill me, then will we be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants and serve us. Again, he's baiting them into a one-on-one contest. So Goliath is very, very proud. He's also very, very confident. He's well equipped, he's well armored, but he's very, very confident that, these armies aren't necessary. Let's settle this, just me, just one Philistine. And you pick, of all the servants of Saul, you select a man, you select your hero, you select your champion, let him come down and fight against me. And if I kill him, you'll be our servants. If he kills me, we'll be your servants. Right? Now, does that sound like an enticing contest? If you are the children of Israel, probably not. Because he looks like the biggest and the best of theirs, and he looks bigger and better than anything right now that you have at your disposal. If anything, what you want is a battle where what? Where there's safety in numbers. And maybe, Goliath's 9 feet tall, but I bet 20 Israelites could whip him, right? I bet if you got a bunch of them, you could. But this sounds like baiting, right? Just me, just one. Why all the army? Verse number 8, why come out to set the battle in array? One-on-one. Me, and you choose the best among you. Certainly, the servants of Saul, certainly among your crew, you've got someone that's up to the task and up to the challenge. And notice what he says in verse 10. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. The Philistine says, I defy the armies of Israel. Now, when the Bible uses the word defy, there's a number of meanings that are attached to that. There's still a number of meanings attached to it. The word defy or defiance can mean a number of things. Defiance can refer to disobedience, right? When you defy someone, that can be a reference to a rebellious disobedience. We still use that word that way sometimes. Sometimes the word defy can mean to almost dare or to challenge, right? Where, I defy you to do this. It's almost like an enticement or a daring or a challenge to do it. That's the majority of the intended meaning here, and yet in the Hebrew word there's also the added implication of reproach. Basically, Goliath is branding them with cowardice. I dare you, and the implication is that if you don't, you are nothing but puny, pathetic, weak, cowardly, yellow, puny Israelites. And it was said with disdain, and it was said with disgust. You won't dare challenge me. Now I challenge you, but you won't dare stand with me. I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. And so the challenge is issued by Goliath, right? We know of this very well. In verse 11, it says, when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. That's what Goliath wanted, wasn't it? He wanted to strike fear into them. In any contest, that's one way that you want to get the upper hand, right? And it could be in war, it can be in battle, it could be in any kind of other contest, right? If you can demoralize your opponent and if you can intimidate them, you can get an upper hand before the battle even begins, right? When you're in a contest with someone, you want their actions to be out of fear and apprehension and hesitation and an overly cautiousness. You don't want your opponent to act as an aggressor. You don't want your opponent to have confidence. You don't want them to come from a place like that. And so Goliath, he's intimidated them. He's come out. He's absolutely intimidating just by his appearance. But just in his language, an attempt to bait them and draw one of them into a one-on-one contest, he feels so overly confident that he can defy and blaspheme and add reproach and add cowardice to the children of Israel. And they're afraid. It says there in verse number 11 that when Saul and all Israel heard those words, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now, Saul's the king of Israel. Why would he be afraid? Actually, come to think of it, who's the fittest one in the children of Israel to go and fight this battle? Now, you would think that Israel would send out their biggest and best too, right? Does Israel have someone who, what's the language? is head and shoulders above everyone else? They do, don't they? Israel has a prime contestant. They have someone that's head and shoulders literally above everyone else. And you know who that is? It's King Saul. And yet Saul doesn't have the courage to go, does he? No longer does Saul have the strength to go either. As the Spirit of the Lord has departed from him, he has neither courage nor strength to step up to this task. So Goliath issues this contest, and the guy that's apparently the most fit for the job isn't willing, and no one else is either. And they're all dismayed, and they're all afraid. Now, number 2, let's bring David onto the scene. Number 2, David on the scene. Verse number 12, it says, "Now David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse. He had 8 sons. The man went among men for an old man in the days of Saul." Jesse isn't a young man anymore. Jesse's not even young enough to be on the battlefield with Saul during these things. He's an old man with 8 children. It says in verse 13 that the 3 eldest sons of Jesse went and followed Saul to the battle. Now, whether they were enlisted or whether they were drafted to be, whether they were there in what would be considered their father's place, maybe that's the connection from verse 12 to 13. Some do, that's fine. But 3 of Jesse's sons went and followed Saul to the battle. The names of his 3 sons that went to battle with, the name of his 3 sons that went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, and next unto him Aminadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 eldest followed Saul. So Jesse is an old man. His 3 oldest sons are with Saul at battle, and we again are reminded that David is the youngest. And verse 15 says, "But David went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem." David has gone home by this point. As you read the first 14 verses of this chapter, you're not to suspect that David is right there in the midst or the heat of all of this, right? David was called into Saul's service in the previous chapter to play for him, to soothe his mind. But when David wasn't needed, and David certainly wasn't there at the front lines of this battle at this point. Actually, when David's services weren't needed, he went home. He went home apparently in verse number 15 to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. When his service wasn't needed, it's interesting to see how this verse shows you part of that shepherd's heart that David had. Right? Now here's David. I don't know that anybody would blame David if he stayed at the royal court, right? David is someone who's been anointed to be king. Now, not everybody knows that yet. It's still only a select group, a very small group of people that know that. But wouldn't it be in David's best interest to maybe hang around? Even if Saul's gone off to battle, maybe David should kind of stick around and learn how this politics game is played, right? Learn the politics of power. Maybe get in good or learn from the ministers of state and all those that Saul had surrounded himself with. Nobody would probably blame David for that, but that's not where David's heart was. There was nothing in Saul's court that was attention, that was worth his attention. There wasn't anything at Saul's palace or Saul's court that was an attraction for him, like it might be for others. His heart was still with the sheep, and he went home to take care of his father's sheep at Bethlehem. Verse 16, it says that the Philistine drew near morning and evening and presented himself for 40 days. This went on and on and on. And every day he would come out and reproach and call them cowards and defy them for 40 days. That wears on your conscience, doesn't you? When your enemy just sits there and can shout insult after insult, day after day, demoralizing, right? It's just like with every passing day, it almost just sets in even more, like, we really don't have anybody that's going to go out there and challenge this guy, do we? We don't have anybody that's going to stand up and even make an attempt. And every day that passes almost sinks that in all the more. Verse 17, it says that Jesse said unto David his son, Take now for thy brethren an ephah of this parched corn and these 10 loaves, and run to the camp to thy brethren, and carry these 10 cheeses unto the captain of their 1,000, and look how thy brethren fare, and take their pledge. Jesse wants to know how his sons are doing, and he sends David on an errand. He sends him with food. He sends a gift for the captain of their thousands, and he wants to check on David's brethren. Go and check on them and take their pledge. You know, it's likely that depending on how long David's brothers had been gone, they may have sold off, you know, some of their belongings to make money for other reasons, and David was to go with and restore those things, right? To take the pledge, and if they've given up some of their stuff for money or for food or for whatever it was, David went with money to make those kind of things right. It says there in verse number 20 that David rose up early in the morning. David didn't sleep in. If you and I had a big task, if you and I had a big job to do the next day, we'd get every wink of sleep that we could. We'd sleep in till the last possible minute, knowing the big day that was ahead. David didn't do that. He got up early in the morning. Why? Because he wanted to make sure, according to verse number 20, that he could leave the sheep with a keeper. David has a shepherd's heart. We are seeing that time and time again. When others might have stayed at the royal court, David went home to take care of the sheep. When David had a big errand to run, had a big responsibility, something to do for his father, he didn't neglect the other responsibilities that he had. He wanted to make sure that his sheep were left with a keeper. And he did that. There's just so much in those phrases, right? They're almost dropped in there like nuggets, but don't miss that this shows you where David's attention was, where David's affection was, that David really understood what it meant to be a shepherd and was himself a good shepherd. And as we've mentioned before, that sheds new light when you read Psalm 23, that these are the words spoken from a guy that knows what it's like to be a shepherd, that knows what it takes to be a good shepherd. David certainly was. But it says in verse 20 that he went as Jesse had commanded him, and he came to the trench as the host was going forth to the fight, and shouted for the battle. Well, hey, that's pretty cool, right? Okay, maybe they've mustered up some strength. Maybe now they're actually there's some resolve. And they're going to fight this battle after all. They're going to war with the Philistines finally. Notice what it says in verse 21. For Israel and the Philistines had put the battle in array, army against army. Like, that. This is really going to happen now, right? Okay, Goliath has made his challenge. No, it doesn't seem like maybe they're going to do the one-on-one, but it does seem like everybody's ready for battle. They're going to make this happen. David left his carriage in the hand of the keeper of the carriage and ran into the army and came and saluted his brethren. And as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and he spake according to the same words. And David heard them. Again, another day. And as both sides are preparing their battles, and as both sides are lined up, and it's looked like everybody's getting ready for war, here he comes. Here strolls out Goliath again, and he starts the same obnoxious taunting and defiance and reproaching of Israel. Only this time David heard it. This is the first time David has heard it. Now, it's not the first time Israel's heard it. Israel's heard it at least twice a day for the last 40 days. But David hears it in verse 23. It says, verse 24, and all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were sore afraid. Whatever excitement, whatever energy there was in the last couple verses to maybe actually make today the day we fight this battle and we fight against these Philistines, nope. Not this time again. They're sore afraid. It says that they flee from him. Here's how desperate things have actually gotten. Verse 25. The men of Israel said, have ye seen this man that is come up? Surely to defy Israel is he come up, and it shall be that the man who killeth him, the king will enrich him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. Things have gotten so desperate, like word has started to spread among the camp of all the things that Saul has started to promise. If someone will challenge, if someone will defeat and kill this giant. Like there's a 3-point bribe in here for someone. Money, it says there in verse 25, great riches. It says, secondly, that they'll give him his daughter. You know, that's not something new. That's actually something that was done oftentimes. Yeah, you go all the way back to the book of Judges, and Caleb offered his daughter to someone who would take a victory in battle. And then at the end of verse number 25, make his father's house free in Israel. And that freedom there really speaks to an exemption from all the tributes, the taxes, that they would be freed from all of these things that most families were subject to, right? A 3-point bribe, money, his daughter to marry, and this exemption from all of these tributes and taxes, right? This rise to nobility in the nation of Israel with these 3 things. Well, surely with that changes everything, right? Somebody would surely step up to the challenge. No. That's how bad things were. That's how desperate it was. Then as word starts to spread of all these things, men still have not risen up to the challenge. And David spake to the men that stood by him, saying, what shall be done to this man that killeth this Philistine and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Notice David's response. While others focused on the danger of the battle and the material rewards, David was focused on a couple of other things. The reputation of Israel. You know, when we talk about the word reproach, those are character things. Those are things that speak to your character and your reputation. Israel's character. Israel as a nation has now been, their name dragged through the mud, right? Can you imagine as word starts to spread to the surrounding nations? Like one man threatened Israel and they backed down. One man from the Philistines challenged them and no one was up to the challenge. Just the very name of Israel, the army of Israel would just be, it'd be viewed, ridiculed, right? Just a mark of scorn among the nations. And David saw that, right? Okay, Saul's promised all these things, but what does he promise? What about the guy that can take away the scorn of Israel, right? There's more to this than just the killing of a man. It's more than just a reward for taking away one man's life. Whoever does this, is he not taking away the scorn and reproach of Israel? This man, when Israel refers to this man, how does David refer to him? This uncircumcised Philistine. Who is he that he should defy the armies of the living God? Other men, they're focused on the material and the danger of the battle, and David is focused on the reputation of Israel and the honor of God. Those 2 things provoke David more than the other. And again, it starts to trickle out little by little what it means when the Bible tells us that David is the man after God's own heart. David cares about the things that God cares about. While Israel was focused on all those other things, David comes and hears what this man is saying, and like, the guy that does this, forget, yeah, okay, but all these things have been promised. But the guy that does this, he's the one that's taking away the reproach of Israel. Isn't that a greater reward than money? Somebody's daughter? Who is this man that thinks he can defy the armies of the living God? David was able to see a battle in spiritual terms, not just the material and the fleshly. And the people in verse 27 answered him after this manner, saying, So shall it be done to the man that killeth him. And Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spake unto the men. And Eliab was embarrassed, right? Because it looks like his little brother, it looks like his baby brother's got more courage than he's got. Eliab, his anger was kindled against David, and he said, Why camest thou down thither? And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? Don't you have something else to do? Right? This is big brother talking to little brother. Don't you have somewhere else to be? Don't you have sheep that you need to be looking out? What are you doing here anyway? I know thy pride, the naughtiness of thine heart, for thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle. You're just trying to stir something and start something because you want to see a fight. You want to see a battle. That's what you came down here for, right? You wanted to see a battle. Well, his anger is kindled against his brother. Actually, according to the last chapter, shouldn't Eliab be someone who's confident enough and strong enough to go? You remember what happened when Samuel saw Eliab, the firstborn of Jesse? Surely, this is the Lord's anointed, right? Another guy that looked the part. And Eliab, when his brother comes, he sees him as the little brother who's come to shoot his mouth off. He's embarrassed because I think it becomes clear that Eliab is among the rest that don't have any courage or don't have the courage to go and to stand against Goliath. And he pawns it off, right? He challenges David's motives, questions why he's there. And listen, I hope that's helpful to you, right? You can be 100% in the right frame of mind, concerned about the right things, and somebody will always challenge your motives. Someone will always challenge if you're for real and challenge why you're doing it. So if you've got good motives, if your motives are pure and you're serving the Lord and you're doing things the right way and for the right reason, don't get discouraged just because there's always a jerk, there's always somebody that will come by and challenge, and tell you, you're not in this for the right reasons. Don't you have something else that you could be doing right now? Eliab he's a big brother for sure. But David said, What have I now done? Is there not a cause? Really? Don't put this on me. What did I say? What have I done? I just got here. You all have been listening to this for 40 days. David hears it once, and he's insulted that God's been insulted. David only has to hear this one time, and it bothers him that Israel has been reproached, that God's honor has been insulted. You've got an army of men that's listened to this for day after day after day for 40 days. He hears it one time, and he's ready to stand up and call men on the carpet and say, how come somebody hasn't done something? Are we going to just let this guy stand there and defy the armies of God? This uncircumcised Philistine, this unspiritual heathen stand against God and his people? Is there not a cause? David is very much intense. Is there not a cause? David saw that there was. And it did not take him long to see it. And his cause was not material. It was not fleshly. It was godly. His concern was the honor of God and the reputation of Israel. And the most important thing to David was not Saul's daughter, was not the promise of wealth, was not the promise of a tax exemption, was not the promise of nobility. He had spiritual concerns. David cared about what God cared about. And that's a helpful lesson, I think, for all of us, that in the hustle of this world, as we get caught up in the fleshly things and the material things, David is counted as the man after God's own heart, and evidences that by showing that he cares about what God cares about. Those other things were not priority to him. They were not the most important. David said, "What have I now done? Is there not a cause?" And he turned from him toward another, and spake after the same manner, and the people answered him again after the former manner. Okay, all right, big bro, you don't want to? David would just go, he just start talking to everybody else too, right? If you turn David down, he's going to keep looking. He wants to see, he's not content that there's not someone that'll stand up for the honor of God. And what we're going to find out next week, of course, after verse number 30, people continue to answer him after the same manner. Finally, David's like, all right, I'll do it. I'll do it. When his big brother wouldn't, when King Saul wouldn't, when no one else would, David was insulted that God had been insulted. And I think those are the things that should matter to us, right? The spiritual things. Those seem to be the things that David cared about. All right, we're out of time. Let's go ahead and have a word of prayer, and we'll be dismissed tonight. I know everybody's kind of familiar with this story, but there's so much that lead up to the actual fighting of David and Goliath. I wanted to make sure to give time to cover all that. But David's been home caring for sheep, right? David's concern was not hanging out at the royal palace. David's concern was not hanging out with all of Saul and his war buddies. But the moment that David got there and he heard Israel and the God of Israel being reproached, he's like, whoa, no, he can't do that. Y'all just been letting this happen. Y'all just been sitting here listening to this. And you can tell that David was immediately offended because God had been insulted, and that mattered to him. So let's make that a pointed focus. Let's work on caring about the things that God cares about. Let's worry about those spiritual things and try to do well in those. Father, we're thankful to come tonight.